Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the ASP NET Monsters. This is episode number 4, and our production code today is 1 lowercase v. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about HTML helpers and how they relate to tag helpers.
All right. So there's this great new feature in ASP NET Core, which is a feature they added to Razor called tag helpers. And this is all related to really just the way that we generate HTML on the server side. So that's a big part of ASP.NET with MVC is that we have some sort of model that we're binding to our view, and we're using that to somehow generate some HTML. So what I have open here is a register.cshtml, so it's a Razor view page that's using the traditional HTML helper method for generating inputs and form HTML tags. Now, this view is bound to the register view model, and if we look at that, just so we know what we're dealing with here, it's just a basic, the information that a class representing the information that you would need for a user that's registering for your site. So we start with the email, and we have some attributes that give us some information about that in terms of validation. It's required. It should be an email address, and the display name should be email. And then we have some other properties here as well. Now, the way we generate things like a label or a text box for that using HTML helpers was, let's say just for that email input, for example, we do html.textbox4. We pass it this lambda here to specify the email property name, and then we give it this funny syntax here to define what class it is that we want to add to that input. Ultimately, the output of that will be is this line here. I'll just zoom in a bit so it's easier to see. But ultimately, it will output this simple input tag where the name is email, there's that class, the form control that we've added, the ID again email, the type, there's no value yet because the value is empty, and then all these data-val attributes for the JavaScript unobtrusive validation, which is Simon's favorite JavaScript validation tool.
Yeah, I hate that thing. We're going to talk about how to replace that one of these days.
Definitely.
So at first glance, though, this looks pretty good because I didn't have to type all of that stuff, and I just had to put one line of code. So what are the problems with this?
You're right. It is definitely a lot better than having to do this manually, and we could have done this manually and tried to build it that way every time. So using the HTML helper is great because it enforces consistency. What's kind of odd about it, though, is this mixture of we have a div here, and then I want to put an input here, and as a web developer, I know that it's an input that I want to put in. But I have to switch over to C# now using Razor, so I go and then I'm in C# now, and I have to call a method and pass it some kind of funny-looking parameters here to do things like add classes. So this in particular is the part that I find really hard to work with. If we weren't ever trying to modify the output of that HTML, like adding attributes like classes to it, then this would be fine. But this is kind of weird, and I lose things like IntelliSense. I don't have any of the CSS IntelliSense that I would expect to tell me what all the classes are that are actually in my CSS files. It also gets kind of weird up here for things like doing a form. So we have HTML.begin form to open up our form. And ultimately what this is doing is with the using statement is wrapping this whole section here in a form tag. But there's no visibility to the fact that there will be a form tag here. It's just a bit of a break in logic when you're looking at it.
So there's no way that this could render properly outside of actually having it generated in the browser as a result of executing an action or whatever the case may be. So you can't give this to your designer.
No, I think a designer would definitely struggle with this because they would have to learn a whole new language that's very foreign to them. So that's where tag helpers come in, and what I have in this file is just the exact same register form done using tag helpers. And you can see right away that it's all just HTML. There's a few things at the top where we're doing the at piece here to define the model and a few other things, but for the most part, the entire page is just valid HTML, so it looks and reads like HTML. But if we look at something like that input, you'll notice that it's highlighted a little differently, and that's because it's a tag helper. And the way it became a tag helper, or the way the tag helper kicked in, is by adding this ASP-4 attribute to it. So that's not a standard HTML attribute at all. That's the tag helper attribute that makes it kick in for inputs. So when I type ASP4, actually if I just remove this entirely, so right now it's just a simple class, or a simple input, and it's standard HTML, so I can do things like call dash, and I get my IntelliSense that I would expect from a good HTML editor. But then as soon as I add my ASP4 equals, that's when it turns into a tag helper tag, and I even get my full IntelliSense here. So it knows that 4 is an attribute that binds to my model properties, so it actually lists all my model properties for me. So I grab the email, and that's it. So the way this will render is the tag helper will intercept that input before it gets sent to the client. It'll take the ASP-4 off, that attribute doesn't get sent, and then it'll add all the other model attributes that it needs, like the ID and the name and the data-val. And that's
So
really...
this is kind of reminiscent of Angular directives then.
Yes, very heavily inspired by Angular directives, where you're defining almost you're augmenting standard HTML, intercepting it before it gets sent to the client, and then adding things to it. So these can be as small as just an input in this case, or it can be something bigger where you modify all the contents of it as well. So in a future Monsters Weekly, we'll probably do one on building custom tag helpers and show how easy it is to do that. But for now, these are some of the built-in tag helpers that ship with the framework. We have things like labels, the ASP validation summaries, and validation 4, so that's adding where the actual validation messages are displayed. The form now is actually just a form element, which I can expand and collapse, and I couldn't do that before with the using. But it's just a form, and we tell it what controller name and action it is that we're binding to, specify the method, add any classes we want to it. So it's, now as we were saying, it's something I think that would be a lot easier to pass on to a designer, and even just looking at it, it's a lot easier for a developer, I think, to understand what's going on here.
So you mentioned it's an intercept process between the request and the result that gets back to the client. These tag helpers are not the syntax for them or the keywords for them, the invocation of them. Those are not returned back to the client.
That's right, yeah. Everything is server-side, and the only thing it does is it gets processed once when this Razor view is processed. So it's not, there isn't a whole life cycle associated to these like the old web forms controls. They're really very simple. There's a process method that gets called, and inside that process method, it does something to the output. That's all there is to it.
Great. Okay, so James, has anybody won our prize yet? Won our competition?
No, it's a bit of a puzzle, and I think it still has them puzzling. So we'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for coming out and listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Cheers.
Cheers.
We can call this an edit point, and then come back.
No, we should show people that sometimes things take a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and sometimes they go Ari on us too here. So okay, so this, and that one seems to be locked up. Oh, there it goes.
So there it is.
After 1.67 seconds.
Okay, let's do that again.